The air in the Black Hawk County John Deere dealership always smelled the same. A clean, sharp mix of fresh green paint, curing rubber, and the faint, sweet tang of hydraulic fluid. It was the smell of progress, the smell of money. To Arthur Jensen, it mostly smelled like debt. He stood just inside the big glass doors, his worn denim jacket and mud-caked boots a stark contrast to the polished concrete floor. His knuckles were scraped raw from wrestling with a seized water pump on his old Farmall M, and a smear of black grease decorated his left temple like a warrior's mark. Across the showroom, Donnie Peterson, the dealership owner, was leaning against the enormous rear tire of a brand-new 4430. Donnie was a man whose hands had grown soft, his belly pushing against the pearl snaps of his western shirt. He was laughing, a loud, booming sound that echoed off the high ceiling, slapping the shoulder of the man he was talking to. That man was Rick Sullivan. Rick was everything Arthur was not. 10 years younger, he farmed his father's land with the bank's money. He wore a clean seed corn cap, crisp Wrangler jeans, and boots that looked like they'd never seen the business end of a manure fork. He was gesturing at the 4430, a magnificent beast of a tractor, its sound guard cab sealed tight against the dust and noise of the real world. Inside that cab was a padded seat, air conditioning, and an AM/FM radio. It was a palace on wheels compared to the open-air, iron saddle punishment of Arthur's Farmall. Arthur shuffled his feet, feeling the grit under his soles. He just needed a set of points and a condenser for the M's distributor. A $10 transaction, maybe. He hated coming in here, feeling like a ghost from a bygone era amidst all this gleaming, expensive machinery. He walked past a new 6-row planter that cost more than his entire farm was worth in 1950 and approached the parts counter. "Morning, Dale," Arthur said to the young man behind the counter, whose face was covered in acne that even a thick parts manual couldn't hide. "Mr. Jensen," Dale mumbled, not looking up. Before Arthur could list his needs, Donnie Peterson's voice cut across the showroom. Well, if it isn't Arthur Jensen, come to trade in that museum piece of yours?" Rick Sullivan turned, a smirk playing on his lips. "Don't bother him, Donnie. He's probably just here to look. A man can dream, can't he?" Arthur felt a slow heat rise up his neck. He kept his eyes on the parts counter. "Just need some ignition parts for the M, Donnie." Donnie pushed himself off the tire and sauntered over, his boots clicking on the clean floor. "The M? Lord Art, my grandpa had one of those. You know, for a few thousand down, I could put you in that 4430. We've got financing plans even a man like you could handle. Boost your productivity. Farm like it's 1972, not 1942. The M runs fine," Arthur said, his voice low and even. "She just needs a little tune-up. Doesn't ask for much." Rick laughed outright. "Doesn't ask for much and doesn't give you much either. I plowed 80 acres yesterday before supper, Art. Bet you didn't get 20 done on that old smoke belcher." "I got enough done," Arthur said, meeting Rick's gaze for the first time. There was a challenge in the younger man's eyes, a cocksure arrogance that came from signing loan papers with a steady hand. Arthur's father had a saying, "Never be proud of the size of your mortgage." He saw that pride radiating off Rick Sullivan in waves. "Dale, get the man his parts before they rust," Donnie said, with a dismissive wave. As Dale fumbled through a dusty catalogue, Arthur had an idea. It was a quiet, stubborn sort of idea, the kind that grew slowly in the back of his mind, like a cornstalk in July. He turned to Donnie. "Actually, Donnie, before I pay for these, I just want to check my balance." Donnie Peterson stopped mid-stride. He blinked, then let out a short, incredulous laugh. Rick Sullivan snorted. "Your balance?" Donnie chuckled, shaking his head as if Arthur had just told the funniest joke he'd ever heard. "Art, with all due respect, we don't run a line of credit for your kind of operation. It's cash on the barrelhead for small parts. You know that." The implication hung in the air, thick and greasy as old diesel smoke. "You're too small, too poor, too risky." Arthur didn't flinch. He just stood there, his weathered hands resting on the counter. "Not my credit balance, Donny. My account balance. The one I put money into every spring." Donny's smile faltered. He frowned. Your parts account?" "That's the one," Arthur said calmly. "Put $500 in back in March after I sold the calves. Been drawing on it for filters and oil. Just want to see where I stand." The showroom suddenly felt very quiet. The smug look on Rick Sullivan's face curdled into confusion. Dale, the parts boy, looked up from his catalogue, his eyes wide. People didn't prepay. They ran up a bill. They financed. They begged for extensions after a bad harvest. They didn't walk in with a positive balance. Donny cleared his throat, his folksy charm evaporating. He walked behind the counter, avoiding Arthur's eyes, and pulled out a heavy green ledger book. He licked his thumb and flipped through the pages, the paper making a soft, rustling sound. He ran his finger down a column. He stopped. He squinted, leaning closer as if he couldn't believe the numbers. "Well, I'll be," he muttered, almost to himself. He looked up at Arthur, a new, strange expression on his face. It wasn't quite respect, but the condescension was gone. "Says here, after these parts, you'll still have a credit of $312.50. Rick Sullivan, who had been leaning against a display of oil filters, stood up straight. "A credit? You mean you gave them money you haven't even spent yet?" Arthur finally allowed himself a small, tight smile. He looked past Donny, past Rick, and out the big window at the rows of new, green tractors sitting silent under the Iowa sun. Each one had a price tag that could choke a horse, and each one represented a mountain of banknotes, interest payments, and sleepless nights. "My father taught me something a long time ago, Rick," Arthur said, his voice just loud enough to fill the space. He said, "The only man who sleeps well is the one who owes nothing to anyone when the sun comes up. I pay my way as I go. That way, the only one I answer to is God and the weather." He took his small paper bag of parts from Dale, nodded once to Donny, and walked out of the dealership. The glass door hissed shut behind him, leaving the two men standing in the silence of their own assumptions, the smell of new paint suddenly feeling a little less triumphant. "Now, before we get too deep into this story, I have to ask you all something. Standing there in that dealership in 1972, who do you think was the smarter farmer? Was it Arthur, with his paid-for iron, his cash-in-hand discipline, and his stubborn refusal to take on debt? Or was it Rick Sullivan, borrowing every penny the bank would give him, leveraging himself to the hilt to get bigger, faster, and more modern? Let me know in the comments below what you would have done, because the path each man chose that day would lead them to two very, very different places when the music finally stopped a decade later. Arthur drove his old Ford F-100 pickup back to the farm, the little bag of parts sitting on the seat beside him. The truck, a 66, was like everything else he owned. Paid for, a little rusty around the wheel wells but mechanically sound. He could tear down the 352 V8 in a weekend if he had to. He knew every bolt, every wire, every quirk. It was his. That simple fact was a comfort deeper than any padded seat. He found the Farmel M parked by the barn, its hood open like a patient on an operating table. It wasn't a pretty machine. The red paint was faded to a dull orange, and dents from decades of hard work peppered its sheet metal. But to Arthur, it was beautiful. His father had bought it new after the war, and its simple, rugged design was a testament to an era when things were built to be fixed, not replaced. The breakdown hadn't been simple. A cracked distributor cap was the initial diagnosis, but as he'd dug in, he'd found the shaft had more wobble than a nervous preacher. The bushings were shot. It was a symptom of a larger fatigue, the slow, grinding wear of 30,000 hours of labor. While Rick Sullivan was turning soil with his climate-controlled 4430, Arthur was spending the better part of 2 days with his hands covered in grease, meticulously disassembling the magneto. He laid the new points and condenser on a clean rag on the fender. With a pair of needle-nose pliers, he carefully set the point gap, using a feeler gauge until it was precisely 20,000ths of an inch. It was delicate work, the kind that required patience and a steady hand. He cleaned the rotor, checked the wires for cracks, and reassembled the whole unit with the care of a watchmaker. By late afternoon, he was ready. He climbed onto the hard iron seat, pulled the choke, and hit the starter. The engine turned over once, twice, then coughed to life with a puff of blue smoke and the familiar, throaty roar of the old four-cylinder. It was a sound that vibrated right through his bones, a song of reliability he'd known his entire life. He let it idle for a minute, listening. The rhythm was steady now, the old miss gone. He had done it. He hadn't called a mechanic. He hadn't bought a new tractor. He had faced the problem with his own 2 hands and won. The satisfaction was immense, more fulfilling than any bank-approved loan could ever be. But that satisfaction didn't put crops in the ground. He had lost 2 full days of planting. The weather forecast was calling for rain by the weekend. He had to make up for lost time. That night, long after his wife Sarah and their 2 young boys were asleep, Arthur was out in the field. There was no sealed cab, no radio to keep him company, just the steady roar of the Farmel's engine and the twin beams of its headlights cutting a weak yellow path through the darkness. The night air was cool and smelled of damp earth. He could feel the vibration of the machine in his teeth, his spine jolting with every rock and furrow. Dust billowed up around him, coating his face and filling his lungs. By midnight, his muscles ached and his eyes burned from staring into the dark. Across the valley, he could see a blaze of light moving steadily back and forth across Rick Sullivan's fields. It was the 4430, its cab lit up like a spaceship, its powerful halogen lights turning night into day. Rick was likely sitting in his air-conditioned bubble, listening to the Grand Ole Opry on the radio, covering 3 acres for every one of Arthur's. The sight sent a pang of something through Arthur's chest. It wasn't envy, not exactly. It was a weary frustration. He was working twice as hard just to keep up. The whispers started at the co-op grain elevator a few weeks later. Arthur was waiting in line to unload his first batch of soybeans, leaning against the fender of his truck. He overheard 2 older farmers, men he'd known his whole life, talking by the scale house. "Heard Art Jensen's old M broke down right in the middle of planting," one said, not bothering to lower his voice. "Doesn't surprise me," the other replied, spitting a stream of tobacco juice. "A man can't farm a half section with sentiment. That Sullivan kid, now he's got the right idea. Go big or go home." Arthur pretended he didn't hear. He stared straight ahead, his jaw tight. He knew what they were saying. They saw his caution as weakness, his self-reliance as foolish pride. In this new era of easy credit and booming prices, his father's lessons about debt and thrift seemed hopelessly outdated. He was a relic, a stubborn fool clinging to the past while the future was being built on borrowed money all around him. Even Sarah was worried. One evening, as she patched a tear in his work jeans, She looked at him, her brow furrowed. "Arthur, are we going to be all right? The Millers just bought a new combine. The Petersons are adding a new silo. And Rick Sullivan, people say he just rented another 200 acres. We're fine, Sarah," he said, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. "We own this land. We own the house. We own the machines. What we make is ours. It's not the bank's." "But we're not getting ahead," she said softly. "We're just treading water." He didn't have an answer for that, because some nights, out there on that old iron seat, with his bones aching and the dust in his throat, he wondered the same thing. The next few years seemed to prove his critics right. The mid-1970s arrived like a golden age for the American farmer. The massive grain deal with the Soviet Union sent commodity prices into the stratosphere. Corn, which had been hovering around $1.50 a bushel for years, suddenly shot past $3. Soybeans followed suit. Land values, which had been stable for a generation, exploded. A farm that was worth $500 an acre in 1970 was suddenly appraised at $2,000, then $3,000. It was a gold rush, and the banks were handing out the shovels. For Rick Sullivan, it was the ultimate validation. His massive operating loans, which had seemed reckless just a few years prior, were now easily serviceable with the fire hose of cash flowing from his expanded acreage. He was no longer just a farmer. He was an agricultural tycoon in the making. He traded in the 4430 for a brand new 40, a monster with over 150 horsepower at the drawbar. He bought a new John Deere 7700 turbo combine, a machine so large it looked like it could swallow Arthur's entire harvest in a single pass. He built new grain bins, a new machine shed, and a new ranch-style house for his family, with a 2-car garage and central air. Rick became the poster boy for modern farming in Black Hawk County. The bankers loved him. The equipment dealers fawned over him. At the diner, other farmers would listen intently as he talked about futures markets and leveraging assets. He drove a new Lincoln Continental, and his wife wore diamond earrings. To everyone, he looked like a genius, a visionary who had seen the future and bet the farm on it. And won. Arthur watched it all with a quiet, gnawing sense of unease. He too benefited from the boom. Those $3 corn years were the most profitable of his life. He and Sarah had more money than they'd ever seen. But his reaction was profoundly different from Rick's. The windfall didn't make him want to borrow more. It made him want to solidify his position, to build his fortress walls higher against the inevitable lean years. His first move was to walk into the Black Hawk County Savings and Loan and pay off the last remaining $8,000 on the farm's mortgage. The loan officer, a young man with a neat haircut, looked at him in disbelief. "Mr. Jensen, with land values what they are, you could refinance and pull out $50,000 of equity. You could use that to buy the Henderson place next door." "I'm not interested in buying the Henderson place," Arthur said, sliding the cashier's check across the desk. "I'm interested in owning mine." He walked out of that bank feeling 10 feet tall. The land his grandfather had broken with a team of mules, the land his father had saved from foreclosure during the Depression, was finally, completely his. Free and clear. No banker could ever take it from him. With the remaining profits, he didn't buy a new tractor. Instead, he found a used John Deere 4220 at an auction. It was a 1968 model, well-maintained, with a diesel engine that was just getting broken in. It was a quantum leap in power and comfort from the Farmall M. But it was still a decade-old machine. He paid $10,000 for it. In cash, the rest of the money went into practical things. A new steel roof for the main barn, a down payment on a college fund for his sons, and the rest, a considerable sum, he put into certificates of deposit at the bank, earning a steady, if unspectacular, 5% interest. To the rest of the county, Arthur Jensen was a failure. He'd been handed a golden ticket and had used it to buy orchestra seats when he could have bought the whole theatre. "Can you believe it?" Rick Sullivan said one day at the parts counter, loud enough for the whole dealership to hear. Art finally gets a little money and he buys a 10-year-old tractor, and I hear he stuck the rest in the bank. The man has no vision. Inflation is running at 10%, and he's happy with a 5% CD. He's literally losing money by saving it. Donnie Peterson just shook his head and laughed. "Some guys are just stuck in their ways, Rick. They're afraid of success." Arthur felt the sting of their words, the weight of their judgment. He was the town fool, the old-timer who didn't get it. While his neighbors were getting rich on paper, expanding their empires on the bank's dime, he was methodically eliminating his risks, battening down the hatches. One crisp autumn evening, Arthur was sitting on his porch, watching the sun set behind the silo. The air was filled with the smell of harvest. He heard the distant rumble of a big diesel engine and saw the lights of Rick Sullivan's new combine working late into the night on a farm 3 miles away. He was running hard, trying to get his massive crop in before the weather turned. Arthur had finished his own harvest a week ago. His crop was smaller, but it was in the bin, and it was all his. Sarah came out and sat beside him, handing him a cup of coffee. "He's still out there," she said, nodding toward the lights. "He has to be," Arthur said. "He's got payments to make." He picked up the Des Moines Register from the small table beside him. On the front page was an article about the new chairman of the Federal Reserve, a man named Paul Volcker. The article talked about his plan to fight runaway inflation by aggressively raising interest rates. Arthur read the words prime rate and variable rate loans. He didn't understand all the financial jargon, but he understood the core of it. The cost of borrowing money was about to go up, way up. A cold knot formed in the pit of his stomach. It was the same feeling his father used to describe when he talked about the fall of 1929. The feeling of standing on solid ground and suddenly sensing a tremor deep beneath your feet, a warning that the whole world was about to shake itself apart. Across the valley, the lights of Rick's new combine seemed to flicker, suddenly looking less like a beacon of progress and more like a candle in a hurricane. The shift began not with a crash, but with a whisper. It was the summer of 1979, and the sky turned a hard, metallic blue. The rain simply stopped. Day after day, a relentless sun beat down, baking the rich black soil of Black Hawk County into a cracked, grey plate. Corn stalks, which should have been shoulder-high and dark green, were stunted and yellowed, their leaves curling inward as if in prayer for a single drop of water. The air grew thick with a fine haze of dust that coated everything in a gritty film and turned the sunsets a bloody, apocalyptic red. Arthur felt the drought in his bones. He watched his crops wither, his ponds shrink, and his well struggle to keep up. He ran the old 40-20 only in the cool of the early morning, cultivating the rows to conserve what little moisture remained, the diesel engine seeming to gasp in the superheated air. His yields would be cut in half, maybe worse. It was going to be a lean year, a year for tightening the belt and digging into the savings he had so carefully put away. For Rick Sullivan, the drought was a catastrophe of a different magnitude. His vast acreage, his enormous investment, required enormous yields to service his enormous debt. He had installed a massive center pivot irrigation system on a quarter section of his best ground, a technological marvel that drew water from a deep well. But it was a thirsty beast, and the diesel generator that powered it drank 5 gallons of fuel an hour, 24 hours a day. With fuel prices climbing, He was spending a fortune just to keep a fraction of his crop alive. The rest of his land, the unirrigated majority, was burning up just like Arthur's. The first real crack appeared in October during the harvest. Rick's massive John Deere 7700 combine, the pride of the county, was working its way through a field of drought-stunted soybeans. The machine was straining, its engine laboring to suck the dry, brittle plants through its header. Suddenly, there was a high-pitched whine from the machine's belly, followed by a loud bang that echoed across the still autumn air. A geyser of hydraulic fluid erupted from the side of the combine, spraying the ground and the withered plants with a fine, oily mist. The massive header drooped, and the whole machine shuddered to a halt. Rick scrambled down from the cab, his face pale under his seed corn cap. The main hydraulic pump, the heart of the complex machine, had grenaded itself. It wasn't a simple fix. It wasn't something you could patch up with a wrench and some baling wire. It was a catastrophic failure that required a specialized mechanic from the dealership and a part that cost over $2,000. For 3 precious, cloudless days, the combine sat silent in the field like a dead green monster, while Rick waited for the part to be flown in from Molin. Arthur, driving by on the gravel road, saw it sitting there. He said a quiet prayer of thanks for his own simple, paid-for, New Holland combine. It was small, slow, and a decade old, but he knew how to fix every chain and belt on it with the tools in his own shed. The whispers at the co-op changed their tune. The talk was no longer about Rick's genius, but about his bad luck. The cost of that breakdown, combined with his dismal yields, was a heavy blow. He grew quiet, his usual booming laughter replaced by a tense, worried look. He spent more time on the phone in the co-op office, his voice low and urgent as he argued with bankers and suppliers. Then came the second blow. In January of 1980, in response to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, President Carter announced a grain embargo. The primary market for America's surplus corn and soybeans vanished overnight. The price on the board at the elevator collapsed. Corn that had been trading at over $3 a bushel plunged to $2.20. Then $2. The bottom fell out of the market. For Arthur, it was painful. He sold his modest crop for far less than he'd hoped. The year's profits were erased. He would be dipping into his CDs just to pay his property taxes and buy seed for the spring. But he would survive. His belt was already tight. For Rick Sullivan, it was a death sentence. He had borrowed money against a crop he'd planned to sell for $3 a bushel. Now he was forced to sell it for $2, leaving a massive shortfall. He had leveraged his skyrocketing land values to secure those loans, but with the farm economy in turmoil, the land market froze. Suddenly, no one was buying. His paper fortune, built on the illusion of ever-rising prices, was evaporating. The final killing stroke came not from the sky or the fields, but from Washington, D.C. Paul Volcker, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, was determined to slay the dragon of inflation. He jacked up interest rates to levels unseen in modern history. The prime rate, the rate banks charged their best customers, climbed to 15, then 18, then an unthinkable 21%. Rick's operating loans were all on a variable rate. It had been the smart move in the 70s, when rates were low. Now, it was a guillotine. The interest on his debt suddenly cost more than he could ever hope to make from the farm. The numbers simply didn't work anymore. The letters from the bank, once friendly and encouraging, became formal, then demanding, then threatening. The empire of Rick Sullivan, built on the sand of easy credit and boundless optimism, was about to be washed away by a tidal wave of debt. The auctioneer's chant was a merciless, rhythmic drone, a funeral dirge for a lifetime of work. It was a cold, grey day in March of 1982, the kind of day that saps all the colour from the world. A bitter wind whipped across the yard of what had been Rick Sullivan's farm, snatching at the hats of the sombre-faced men gathered there. They stood in small, quiet groups, their hands shoved deep in their pockets, their expressions a mixture of pity, morbid curiosity, and the chilling fear that they could be next. Arthur stood near the back, leaning against the fender of his old Ford pickup. He hadn't wanted to come, but it felt like a duty, a need to bear witness. He watched as Rick's life was sold off, piece by piece. The magnificent 4640, barely 3 years old, its tires still thick with tread, sold for less than half what Rick had paid for it. The massive 7700 combine, its hydraulic pump newly repaired, went for a fraction of its value to a syndicate of farmers from the next county over. Planters, discs, cultivators, grain trucks, the entire arsenal of modern agriculture that had once been the envy of the township was dismantled and scattered to the four winds for pennies on the dollar. Donnie Peterson was there, his face ashen. His dealership was on the brink of collapse. He had co-signed on some of Rick's loans, and dozens of other customers were in the same boat. The showroom that had once been a temple of progress was now a morgue of repossessed, unsellable equipment. He avoided Arthur's gaze, his earlier arrogance replaced by a haunted, defeated look. The worst part came when the auctioneer moved on to the personal items: the Lincoln Continental, the new furniture from the ranch house, a child's bicycle left leaning against the garage. Arthur felt a knot tighten in his stomach. This wasn't just a financial collapse. It was the destruction of a family, the public stripping away of a man's pride and identity. He saw Rick standing alone by the machine shed, a ghost on his own land. His wife and kids were gone, staying with her parents in town. Rick just stood there, his shoulders slumped, watching the proceedings with dead eyes. He looked 10 years older than he had that day in the dealership, his face gaunt, his swagger completely extinguished. He was a man who had flown too close to the sun, and the fall had broken him. While the crisis raged around him, Arthur's life took on a quiet, disciplined rhythm. The high interest rates that were destroying his neighbors were, in a strange way, a boon to him. The certificates of deposit he had bought with his profits from the good years were now earning 15% interest. It wasn't a fortune, but it was a steady stream of cash flowing in, not out. It paid the taxes. It bought the seed. It kept him afloat in a sea of red ink. His old machines became his salvation. The John Deere 4020, with its simple, reliable diesel engine, sipped fuel compared to the new, more powerful tractors. When its injector pump started leaking, Arthur didn't call a mechanic. He ordered a seal kit for $30, spent a Saturday in his shop with the service manual, and fixed it himself. He kept the old Farmall M for lighter duties, its gasoline engine easy and cheap to maintain. He was farming like it was 1968, and in the brutal economy of 1982, that was the only way to survive. He became a scavenger, a connoisseur of the wreckage. At the endless stream of farm auctions, he didn't buy tractors. He bought tools, a heavy-duty hydraulic press for $20, a set of industrial-grade wrenches for $10. He bought spare parts for his equipment, alternators, water pumps, filters, stockpiling them in his shed like a squirrel hoarding nuts for the winter. While others had invested in assets, Arthur had invested in independence. The farmers who had once mocked him now approached him with a new respect. They came with questions, not about futures markets, but about how to rebuild a carburetor or set the timing on an old tractor. His farm became an island of stability in a storm. He worked his land, paid his bills in cash, and owed nothing to anyone. Every evening, as he sat on his porch, he could hear the profound, deep silence of the valley. The roar of his neighbors' big new machines had been replaced by an unnerving quiet. Fields that had once been meticulously tilled now lay fallow, their owners gone bankrupt. The landscape was dotted with abandoned farmhouses and for sale signs that no one answered. He had won, but the victory felt hollow, tainted by the sorrow of so much loss. The final piece of land to be auctioned was the 80 acres that held Rick's house, the barn, and the original farmstead his grandfather had built. The auctioneer began his chant, but the crowd was thin. The big money investors had already bought the prime cropland. This was just a house and some buildings, a harder sell. The bidding was sluggish, starting low and crawling upwards. A lawyer representing the bank stood with his arms crossed, a grim expression on his face. Arthur watched Rick, who was still standing by the shed, his head bowed. This wasn't just land. It was his home, his history. Arthur thought of his own farm, of the deed sitting in the safe deposit box, free and clear. He thought of his father's words. The only man who sleeps well is the one who owes nothing. He felt a sudden, powerful conviction. It wasn't about pride or vindication. It was about something else, something deeper. It was about decency. He pushed himself off the fender of his truck and walked toward the auctioneer, his worn boots crunching on the gravel drive. He raised his hand. 50,000, Arthur said, his voice clear and steady. A hush fell over the small crowd. All heads turned to him. The banker's eyebrows shot up. Donnie Peterson stared, his mouth agape. Rick Sullivan lifted his head, his eyes wide with disbelief. The auctioneer, momentarily stunned, recovered his rhythm. I have $50,000 from Arthur Jensen. 50,000. Do I hear 55? 55. Silence. The wind whistled around the corner of the barn. No one else was going to bid. This was a hometown affair now. Sold! The auctioneer cried, his gavel cracking down. For $50,000 to Arthur Jensen. Arthur didn't celebrate. He walked over to the banker, pulled a checkbook from his jacket pocket, and began to write. He was cashing in almost all of his CDs, the nest egg he had so carefully guarded. It was the biggest risk he had ever taken. Later, after the crowds had dispersed and the auctioneers had packed up, Arthur found Rick sitting on the steps of the empty house. The younger man didn't look up as Arthur approached. "Why, Art?" Rick asked, his voice raspy. "Why would you do that? To gloat? To finally rub my nose in it?" Arthur sat down on the step beside him. The wood was cold. "No, Rick, that's not it." He looked out at the familiar landscape, at the rolling hills he had known his entire life. My grandfather homesteaded our place. Your grandfather homesteaded this one. They were neighbors. They helped each other through blizzards and droughts. They understood that this land is more than just a number on a balance sheet. He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I don't want your farm, Rick. I've got enough of my own to worry about. But I couldn't stand by and watch it get sold to some corporation from Chicago that would plow down this house and put up a hog confinement." He turned to look at the broken man beside him. "I'll make you a deal. You can stay here. You can rent the 80 acres from me. The rent will be $1 a year, plus you handle the upkeep and the taxes. You can get a job in town, get back on your feet. You can raise your family in the house your grandfather built. Maybe someday you can buy it back from me for exactly what I paid for it today. No interest." Rick finally looked at him. His eyes were filled with tears. The arrogance, the pride, the rivalry. It was all washed away, leaving only a raw, stunned gratitude. He couldn't speak. He just nodded, a single, jerky motion. Arthur stood up. A man needs a place to stand, Rick. Everything else can be rebuilt from there. He put a hand on Rick's shoulder, a gesture of solidarity that bridged the years of quiet animosity. Then he turned and walked back to his old truck, leaving Rick Sullivan sitting on the steps of a home that was no longer his, but hadn't been lost. The years that followed were a slow healing. The farm crisis left deep scars on the landscape and the community. But those who survived, like Arthur, emerged with a quiet strength. The community's perspective shifted. The flash and swagger of the 70s were gone, replaced by a deep appreciation for the virtues Arthur had embodied all along: caution, self-reliance, and a healthy skepticism of debt. He never became rich, but he became respected. He was the man who had seen the storm coming, not through any special genius, but through the simple, profound wisdom passed down from his father. His 2 sons grew up. The younger one went off to college and became an engineer, but the older one, Michael, came back. He had his father's hands and his grandfather's love for the soil. One bright spring morning in the late 1980s, Arthur and Michael were in the machine shed, working on the old 4020. They had the valve cover off, and Arthur was showing his son how to adjust the valves, his gnarled fingers expertly handling the feeler gauge and the wrenches. "You feel that?" Arthur said, guiding his son's hand. "Just a little bit of drag on the gauge. Not too tight, not too loose. This old engine will run forever if you treat her right." Michael nodded, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Dad," he said after a moment, "I was looking at the farm magazines. They're coming out with these new tractors. GPS guidance, computerized controls. They say we could be more efficient." Arthur wiped his greasy hands on a rag and looked at his son. He saw the same ambition, the same desire for progress that had driven Rick Sullivan, but he also saw a respect for the past. "Efficiency is a good thing, son," Arthur said slowly, "but it's not the only thing. I want you to remember something my father told me. He said this land isn't really ours. We're just looking after it for our grandchildren. The goal isn't to squeeze every last dollar out of it in a single lifetime. The goal is to pass it on to the next generation in better shape than we found it." He gestured around the shed at the old, paid-for equipment. "This stuff here, it represents freedom. The freedom from a banker's letter. The freedom to have a bad year and know you'll still be here for the next one. The biggest, newest machine in the world isn't worth much if the bank owns the key." He picked up the small paper bag that had held the new valve cover gasket, the same kind of bag he had carried out of Donnie Peterson's dealership all those years ago. He smiled a little, a memory flickering in his eyes. "There will always be people who tell you that you need to get bigger, to borrow more, to risk everything to get ahead," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "And they'll make you feel foolish for being careful. But when the music stops, and it always stops, the man left standing is the one who can look the world in the eye and say, 'I owe you nothing.'" He looked out the wide door of the shed, across the greening fields of his farm. The land was his. The machines were his. The future, now resting in the capable hands of his son, felt secure. He had never been the biggest farmer in Black Hawk County. He had never been the richest. But on that spring morning, surrounded by the legacy he had so carefully protected, Arthur Jensen knew with absolute certainty that he was the wealthiest man of all.